Welcome to Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick. Coming up on the programme this week.
It's devastating to hear that young people are in large numbers unable to take those first steps into employment or into further education. It's something we should all be worried about. It's driving up isolation, it's pushing away friends and family, it's stopping us from socialising. We know the more we all talk about it, the more that we can break down stigma and seek support from those around us. Even if you are personally thinking like, oh my God, I've no idea what to do, I've never met someone that hears voices before, let me reassure you now that hearing voices, as an example, or having hallucinations or having paranoia or unshared perceptions, a lot more common than everybody thinks.
The home of the UK's conversation about mental health. Welcome to another edition of the podcast. Thank you for your streams and your downloads, your shares, and for everybody who's getting involved in Mental Health Monday and joining us on the journey as we head towards 350 episodes of the podcast series. What an incredible run. We're still going strong. And I've got some cracking news about next week's episode, where we'll have some breaking news from the team at Hub of Hope, who are expanding as a result of the great work that they've done. If you listen to the podcast regularly, you will know that the Hub of Hope is a database of services for mental health around the UK, and if you go to it, you can find mental health services where you are. There is a new version of the app that's going to be created, and we'll be talking about that as part of next week's show, as well as some insight into what the Hub of Hope is doing, how it's doing it, and the incredible difference it's making to people's lives. The Hub of Hope app and hubofhope.co.uk. This week, though, we're going to have a chat with Rosie Wedley from Mind. Now, Rosie is here to talk about some, it's data which suggests that on a day like Time to Talk Day, which obviously was at the start of the month, people still are unsure about talking about mental health. And the real reason why we do this podcast is to talk about mental health and actually be seen to be talking about mental health. So showing people that this is how you can talk about mental health. This is the language potentially that you could use. These are how people might frame it to other people. And actually, if you look at some of the latest data from Mind and Rethink Mental Illness, a third of people would rather avoid discussing their mental health than risk an awkward conversation. Around half of 16 to 24-year-olds admit they actually push people away, compared to those over the age of 75, who are much more likely to have that conversation. You know, young people are much more mental health aware, but actually that social stigma is still having an impact. 39% said they push friends and family away or had stopped socialising as a result of not talking about their mental health. A fifth say not talking is causing them to struggle at school or at work. And that number is even higher when you look at young people who are between the ages of 16 to 24-year-olds. And actually, one of the big barriers to it is a fear of being judged, or the idea that if you tell someone about your problems, you're going to burden them. And actually, hopefully with Rosie, we're going to cut through some of those myths and talk about where some of these stats come from. But first and foremost, on a day like Time to Talk Day, it's so important to have this conversation.
It was launched in 2014, and that's quite a long time ago in terms of the conversation on mental health. But there is absolutely still quite a lot to do. And this year we've released some new data which reveals people are preferring to keep silent about their mental health rather than risk an awkward conversation. And young people are disproportionately affected by this silence. So we want everyone to feel comfortable talking about mental health.
We know that sort of young people are facing a whole host of mental health issues because of everything that they're experiencing at the moment, and social media is a factor, COVID's still a factor as well. But I'm told regularly by young people themselves that they're more maybe mental health aware than generations before. But there's quite clearly an imbalance there, isn't there, between the awareness and knowing about it and then being able to talk about it. And that's an important thing we've got to get our heads around, isn't it?
And that silence is impacting all our lives. It's driving up isolation, it's pushing away friends and family, it's stopping us from socializing. And we want to encourage people to get comfortable talking about their mental health, because we know the more we all talk about it and listen to each other, the more that we can break down stigma and seek support from those around us. And Time to Talk Day is about that. It's about that, having that opportunity to start a conversation in your community.
What are you hearing in terms of the data, and also anecdotally, Rosie, about the impact of not talking? So young people choose not to talk. What are the consequences of that being the case?
that we know talking about mental health isn't always easy, and statistics are showing us that we're all still shying away from those conversations. For young people specifically, um, nearly half of people we spoke to said that they stopped socializing or they pushed away loved ones because of how they've been feeling, and not because they've not been able to talk about it. It's affecting their performance at school or work. That was over a third of respondents. So the impact's there. It's tangible. It's visceral.
Yeah, no, absolutely as well. And of course, when it starts affecting a young person's ability to start making decisions, and we've seen in other studies about, people not applying for jobs because they don't feel worthy of it, or they don't have the confidence or self-belief to take that next step into a college, or even sometimes even to make social plans. They feel like they would rather step away from that. And that's sort of like the sort of, I don't want to say softer impacts of the mental health crisis, but those things often don't show up, do they, in NHS data lists or things like that? This sort of data goes to show you that there's a profound effect that affects a young person's life day in, day out.
Yeah, and not just that young person either, but the society in general. Workplaces are missing out of the unique insights and expertise that younger workforce brings into them. The consequences aren't just existing inside the individual that's struggling. Or even though it's devastating to hear that young people are in large numbers unable to access their own social structures and support systems, or like you say, take those first steps into employment or into further education. But something we should all be worried about, not just those of us that have got a young person in our lives, because the consequences of that impact touch us all and affect us all.
Obviously, for Time to Talk Day, an encouragement to talk, but then two of the reasons why um, people aren't talking. Top two reasons: fear of burdening others or not
Mm.
being understood. So it goes to show that although even if someone wants to talk, there's a worry about what that response could be, or the world in which they're going to start to start sharing their difficulties with. And that's a concern, isn't it? And that's maybe one of those things where we need to be able to talk, but also we need to have the confidence that people will be there to listen.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for the young people, as if there's some other group that we've not all been a part of at some point. But for a generation that is coming of age at the moment, the context for their their experiences is relevant, right? So this is an age group that um, grew up during the pandemic, during one of the most uncertain, scary times where there were big, important, awful things happening, and very little like in the way of structure or safety, psychological safety for everyone, let alone for one specific group. So I often think about that and what that might the consequences of that experience might be. And when we spoke about the impact of the pandemic at the time, we knew that this was going to be one of the potential outcomes, that we were going to see um, a knock-on consequence effect in the mental health of young people that would last years afterwards, which is why waiting lists for CAMS is where they are, and why so many people, millions of people, um, children, young people, and adults are still waiting for support. So yeah, it is important to be able to talk, but we also need to create a space where, um, when someone does open up, we are able to listen and to hold that space without, the person worrying that they're going to be adding to an already dramatic or an already overwhelming load that everyone is carrying. It's very thoughtful, really, when you think about it, that so many young people are so worried about adding to someone else's stress that they're internalizing.
No, absolutely, and it goes to show that there's that sort of like, well, I won't say anything because 'cause I'll make things worse for other people. It does though show you that within our own minds, sometimes our problems feel that they're so huge that if you do share them, you feel like you're gonna make other people's lives worse, whereas actually many people who share those stories, even in the process of saying it out loud and hearing it being validated by someone,
Yeah.
instantly makes you feel better. And I think a lot of those people who might think, "Oh, I'm gonna burden somebody," it if they went through with the process, I think they'd probably find that actually, oh, no, they weren't burdened by that at all. In fact, they were quite helpful. And again, it speaks to
Mm.
that fear of the unknown, doesn't it? Of
Yeah.
speaking out.
Yeah, and I think a quite a helpful thing is to kind of in your own mind, if you're worrying about adding to someone's emotional load, flip the roles and think, would I want them to talk to me if they were struggling? If they were feeling like this, would I want them to hold that away from me? No, absolutely not. High levels of empathy in our young people and in the generations that are coming of age now are one of the shining lights of the future. One of the things that gives us all hope. And that empathy and that ability to see things from the perspective of the other person is a huge blessing, but needs to be used like both ways, basically. I think lots of young people, when you frame it like, well, would you want someone to hold it back from you? Would be very quick to say, oh my God, no, always tell me, always come to me. I'm always going to want to listen to you. And um, I think that's something that we kind of have to practice what we preach, whichever generation you're from.
I think that's a brilliant answer. Let me ask you, Rosie, because I think there's nothing more awkward than sitting down with someone and saying, I want to talk to you now about this. Okay, three, two, one, go. What are those things that you could do with someone on Time to Talk Day or any day where you want to be able to have a conversation with them, but you don't want it to be the let's turn the TV off, sit in silence while I then start
Lots
to
of
say things, yeah, which let's be absolutely honest, is far too intense.
sense, and
And
it's not how people communicate, and it's not how meaningful things are exchanged, is it? Side by
exactly.
side activities are actually a really good way to introduce something that you might be feeling awkward about because you don't have that direct eye contact. Your hands are busy. You've got kind of like a sort of surface activity to occupy you both. So, driving somewhere together, or doing washing up, or even some cleaning, or something where your hands are busy and you're not sort of facing each other in that really intense, like, "Now tell me about your feelings" kind of setup. That's a really good kind of environment to kind of identify as a good place to start having the conversation. And in terms of having the conversation, um, I'm gonna approach this from the side of the person that's in the listening sort of dimension. But I also want to acknowledge that conversations like this generally tend to be two-way, and the moment you start sharing your experiences, someone else is going to want to start talking to you about how they understand or they can relate or they can see what you might mean because they've also been through something similar. That's very human. So asking questions that are open rather than closed, so things that you can't answer with yes no, how, what, rather than why, or well, why not so much, but asking open questions and genuinely listening to what they have to say in response. Also being aware that this conversation isn't about you trying to fix it or find a solution. This is about hearing what's going on and acknowledging what's going on. So there's a temptation to kind of sort of hover around or zoom in with the answers, or why don't we just? And again, that's really human. You hear someone's in pain, you want to heal the pain. Um, but hold back on that one. Just be patient, give them the space they need, and let the conversation go where they need to take it. And then, you might hear some stuff that's tough to hear, especially if it's like a child or someone that you are quite close to, and you may need to take care of yourself afterwards. So, in your own space and time, maybe writing down what you heard, what your feelings were, and separating your own emotions out from the other person's.
Brilliant advice. I think naturally we as humans try to fix a problem
Yeah.
straight away, don't we? And actually, you touched on it there, but one of the worst is, well, it's you, you'd like to think that people don't say this, but I think we're aware that they do. You know, the classic, well, what have you got to be upset about? You've got a lovely home and you've got a lovely family who care about, and you can sort of like,
That infamous bright side.
yeah, it's the sort of like, yeah, it's the sort of yeah, but which is
Mhm.
for me is now the big difference between sympathy and empathy. Yeah, I can see what you're going through there, but come on, pull yourself together versus
Yeah.
that more empathetic question that people maybe wouldn't go for. But what I find is, again, opens it up is how long have you been feeling like this? Or when did you first start noticing these
Yeah,
feelings?
that's a good one.
Because it
Yeah.
makes that person, even in and of themselves, frame their own thoughts within a wider time scale. And I find a question like that, it almost it distracts your own mind from going to the what we would do. Oh, come on, let's just get a cup of tea and let's go and do something else and
Yeah.
let's forget about it. Like, oh yeah, well I gave her a cup of tea and she seemed a lot better after that. Like we there is a very human thing there, and it's a very old school way of dealing with a problem. And yet those sort of deeper questions which allow you to sort of just go, just keep talking. I'll just you just keep and say as much as you need to say.
Yeah, you've
Uh,
got to manage your own discomfort, haven't you? And
yeah,
I think that reaching for the bright side or the let's make a cup of tea or let's move on from it is often about getting away from our own feelings about what we've heard, or the idea that someone we truly treasure and care so much about is in pain and we can't necessarily stop it. We try and reframe. And there's a place and time for reframing and considering alternative perspectives. But most often that reframing gets received as you're not justified in your feelings, or those feelings aren't valid and you should, be stronger. And so it feeds into all kinds of stigma, that stuff, even though it comes from usually very like genuine place of caring and wanting to help. When we frame things in terms of, well, yeah, okay, that's tough, but other people have it worse. We kind of create a situation where there's literally only one person on the entire globe that is allowed to feel bad about their stuff, about their world or what's going on, and everyone else should should somehow suck it up, which is, not true at all. And all pain is valid and relevant, and that's a really hard thing to sit with when you are so desperate to ease the pain that of the person you're sitting and talking to. So I get it, but yeah, that's one of the main things about having a conversation is holding back your own stuff and sitting in your own discomfort if you need to.
that point of listening and hearing, and that person expressing their emotions, maybe becoming upset or however they respond. There's no expectation of the listener to, at that point, then fix all issues and then sort of move on. What are the appropriate steps that that person should take once they've listened, they've talked through an issue, they've had that sort of back and forth, that person's expressed what they've gone through. You don't want to then go, right, great, can I put Coronation Street on now?
Yeah.
But what are
Yeah.
those sort of progressive next steps that are practical and actually will deliver a result potentially down the line?
So the first thing is asking the person that's opened up to you, like, what would you like to happen next? What have you not what have you tried already? Because that can be a bit sort of challenging, but have you explored anything that might make you feel differently about this? Feeling out what they think about speaking to a health professional or a therapist or, a faith or a community leader, whatever is appropriate for that person. Exploring who else knows, just trying, like you were saying about like, when did you start feeling this way? Trying to build out a picture of what those feelings are in that person's broader life and how they like fit in can often point the way to the logical next steps. So if, for example, you're having a conversation with someone who's talking about feeling really low or really anxious and struggling to, stay connected to their friends. Do any of your friends know about this? When was the last time you spoke to them? What kinds of contact feel most and least discomforting for you? And that can start to build itself out to a plan of like, well, maybe we could drop them a text, or maybe they could come round for coffee, or you can sort of start to identify literally just one step at a time, one stepping stone onto the next one, onto the next one. There are times though where you'll hear something and think, "Oh my gosh, I'm really worried," and particularly if someone's expressed something about like feeling like they want to harm themselves or having harmed themselves, or feeling like they've been thinking about taking their own life. Or if they've sort of expressed something that you're like, do you know what, that doesn't make much sense to me, and I'm worried that you're seeing things or hearing things that aren't there, or I don't necessarily agree with that. I mean, it sounds a bit paranoid to me. The first thing to do is to like name what you've noticed or what you've heard with that person, and just say like, look, I've just heard you say this. Is that what you meant? And then having like a quite a non-judgmental conversation about like how to keep themselves safe, what sort of support they can access. If someone is actively suicidal and they're telling you, I'm ready to take my own life here, then those actions are obvious and immediate, it's, calling 999, going to A&E, calling NHS, asking for option 2, so that they can, be assessed by a clinical professional. But oftentimes it's not that kind of acute. It's just kind of more like in the background, a bit of a niggling concern. And the first thing you can do to help them address that concern is by naming it and talking about it in a really non-judgmental way. Even if you are personally thinking like, oh my God, I've no idea what to do. I've never met someone that hears voices before. Let me reassure you now that hearing voices, as an example, or having hallucinations or having paranoia or unshared perceptions, are a lot more common than everybody thinks. And it doesn't necessarily lead to a lot of the things that a lot of people would imagine, like hospitalization or anything like that. But it is important to talk about those things. And again, that's why Time to Talk Day is so important, because in the context of what can start off as like quite a gentle, like open conversation, you can sometimes uncover some really revelationary things, and that can be transformative for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And a key sort of the difference there between mental health and then signs of mental illness, but actually awareness that there's a spectrum right along the way that people might need to be aware of, but they don't have to be the experts themselves. They can signpost to those organizations.
Said it much better than I just did. Yes.
No, absolutely. But I think it's really important to clarify. It reminds me of a conversation I had with somebody who was expressing some thoughts and feelings. And we were talking about when did they start feeling like that, and they related it back to the death of it started around the time of the death of a loved one, and
Yeah.
straight away you go, right, this then makes much more sense to me. And also then when we talked about what sort of conversations might be forthcoming, we could then frame them within that grief environment, and to look at those sort of support services that are out there. And I think that's that thing around the scale of, and it might be even, people can bring things up from 20 years ago, from a time that they got divorced or that they lost their job, and all of those things can really come to the fore. Now, I think it's obviously a really important time and a really important conversation. Now, one last thing, Rosie, and people say this to me all the time when I talk about mental health on Time to Talk Day or Blue Monday or Brew Monday, they go, every day should be, and I say, yeah, but today is a day with a title. And it's a day where me and Rosie are having this conversation because of this day. And we're not saying only talk on this day. You can talk on any day. But that skill set's important, isn't it? And if these days create those moments to think, actually, I probably should have a conversation with someone. And if that conversation eventually takes place in Easter half term or whatever it would be, but the skill set comes from the reminders that you get from hearing about a day to day, it means a day like today is an important one.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I have no comments. That is perfectly expressed.
And the tone of people when they get that. Because the other thing I always think is, what are you hoping to, particularly those who are very aggressive on it, Rosie, and I get them quite, every day should be Time to Talk Day. It was like, but it isn't. And we've got years and years and decades and centuries of stigma to break down. So if this is the one day that offers the little chink of light for one person, then it's worthwhile.
I do understand that, there's a question to ask about, like, do we need an awareness day for this? And you've hit the nail on the head. Like, who does it harm that we do?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Rosie, thank you so much for your time. I'm hoping that this year's obviously the yearly event will be sort of another opportunity to spark that conversation. And I always say, one person hears it thinks, that's me, that I should have that conversation, or I should try and spark that conversation. I think it makes all the world. And, in 20 years' time, we'll still be having this conversation. But again, the stats will be different. They'll have shifted, we hope, in a positive direction. And we can then be focusing maybe on groups and talking about, how we can target a particular group whose stats look particularly bad at that point. But yes, such an important conversation.
Yeah, well, I certainly think so, but I guess I'm kind of biased.
Rosie, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate you joining us today.
It was a pleasure. Take care.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's podcast. Thanks for checking out Mental Health Monday. My name is Mick Coyle. You can find me on Twitter at Mr. Mick Coyle. You can also find me, Mick Coyle, on Facebook as well. Don't forget, if you want to speak to somebody about your mental health, you can do so. The Samaritans, free to call on 116 123. You can find mental health services where you are. Just look for the Hub of Hope. Type in your postcode. It'll find those mental health services close to you. And for support in a crisis, you can text SHOUT to 85258. That's if you're experiencing a personal crisis, you're unable to cope and need support. Shout to 85258. That's a text line. Do get involved in those services. In an absolute emergency, always remember the number to call is 999. Thanks for downloading the podcast this week. We'll be back next week with more Mental Health Monday.